Good evening. On behalf of New York Law School Law Review and New York Law School, I welcome you to our dinner tonight in celebration of Dean James Simon. Today's panels were indeed thought-provoking and engaging. Thank you for spending your evening with us in what is sure to be a unique opportunity to participate in a conversation between two award-winning legal historians and authors and gain a glimpse of the important exercise of understanding and writing about history. At this time, I would like to invite Professor Edward Purcell to the stage to introduce what is sure to be a great event tonight. We're really in for a treat now. This is our conversation between Professor Annette Gordon-Reed and Dean Simon. Thank you.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Charles Evans Hughes are a famous pair. So too are Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, though until some incisive recent scholarship, very few people knew, or at least admitted, that fact. Tonight, I am here to introduce a third famous pair. Making a dual introduction like this is a trifle unnerving, because each of the members of this illustrious pair is a past master of the dual biography form. Relying on their affable and tolerant natures, however, I will hazard my attempt. James F. Simon attended Yale College as an undergraduate and received his law degree from Yale Law School. Annette Gordon-Reed attended Dartmouth College and received her law degree from what some Yale graduates might refer to, as Mark Twain referred to not heaven, as the other place. After completing their legal educations, they wandered for several years in a variety of deserts: journalism, government, legal practice, until each finally arrived at the welcoming oasis of New York Law School. Jim arrived in 1975, Annette in 1992. Thereafter, their scholarly careers flourished promptly and brilliantly. Jim published his second book almost immediately and went on to write 6 more superb and illuminating studies. Together, those 8 books essentially cover the sweep of American constitutional history, from the battles at the founding between Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall over the nation's direction in its early years, to the struggles in our own time between the justices on the Rehnquist Court over the nation's direction in the 21st century. Over the years, Jim's books have won widespread acclaim and garnered numerous prizes and awards, including the prestigious Silver Gavel Award of the American Bar Association. In addition to producing that steady stream of superb books, Jim also found time to spend 9 years, from 1983 to 1992, as New York Law School's dean, where, among his many actions, great and small, he decided to give me a job. He was clearly a bold and fearless dean. Annette arrived at New York Law School with a passionate and truly inspiring scholarly interest in the history of American race relations, especially in the intersecting lives of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Determined to probe as deeply as possible, committed to the most meticulous standards of analysis, and willing to question established views and, where necessary, to challenge the most renowned scholars in the field, she wrote a path-breaking book on Jefferson and Hemings that compelled major revisions in the views of historians, the general public, and even most of Jefferson's own living descendants. Annette followed that with 2 more fine books on race relations, and then triumphed with her magnificent 4th book, The Hemingses of Monticello, a book that swept the nation's highest scholarly awards and won so many other prizes as well that no one, except perhaps Bill James, baseball's wizard statistician, could even count them. Small wonder, then, that shortly thereafter, the other place came calling. To that capsule summary of their scholarly careers, I feel compelled to add a personal note. I have had the exceptional good fortune of knowing both Jim and Annette for many years. I have enjoyed their company and profited immensely from talking with them about law, race, history, politics, and a nearly infinite variety of other subjects. Both are kind, thoughtful, informed, generous, and in the highest degree intellectually stimulating. I am proud and delighted to be able to call each of them my colleague and my friend. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to welcome Jim Simon and Annette Gordon-Reed. Yeah. Okay. You ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay.
All good to go.
Annette, could I, before we get started, just thank a few people. I just thought the panelists were wonderful, and I just thought it was a great program, and I thank you all very, very much. And what I call the two Sarahs, Sarah Ferguson and Gyra, who really organized the law review and the symposium, and of course Marcy Grigsby. And I wanted to also mention two deans. One is Rick Matisar, whose idea, the original idea, was to have this symposium, and our new dean, Anthony Crowell, who's here tonight. And finally, so my colleagues and so many friends and former students and my dear family, my wife Marcia and my 3 children, David, Lauren, and Sarah are here, and they're so dear to me, and I'm so glad everybody could be here tonight. Thank you.
Well, making statements, it's very great for me. It's wonderful to be back, to see so many old friends. I've been back to have lunch with people, but never back in the building, and it's beautiful. I'd forgotten. I was here briefly. I never got a chance to teach here, but it's wonderful to see the place. A great view up on overlooking the city and so forth. So I'm very, very glad to be back and glad to speak with Ed. Ed has been so important in my career. I'd written my first book without telling anybody that I was writing a book, except my husband. And I think David Schoenbrod may have known whom I refer to as my office husband, knew that I was working on something because I was there all the time. And when I finished the manuscript, Ed was the first person that I gave it to take a look at it to make sure that I wasn't making a total fool of myself. And I've been very grateful to him for his insights and his encouragement. So should we get started?
Let's get started.
Okay.
I mean, the first thing I'd like to do is I'm just wondering, because Sarah said that we were both award-winning authors, and I'd like to trade my ABA Gavel Award for your Pulitzer Prize, if you don't mind.
I think I'll keep it, even though I have to say, of all of the awards, the Pulitzer is the most nondescript. It's like a paperweight. As a matter of fact, I left it at the luncheon when I left, and then they had to send it to me. But I guess they figure, oh, well, you know, it's the Pulitzer. You don't deserve more than that. So
let me start out asking questions that I assume you will all be interested in, because I am. How did you get interested in American history, and how did you get interested in writing American history?
I got interested in American history as a child. I read books about books of history before I read a biography of Jefferson when I was a young person, and that interested me in Monticello and slavery as an institution. My parents were very political people, and so they talked very much about, you know, the racial situation. I grew up in Texas, and that was always ever present. I integrated our county school district. They were still resisting Brown after many years. And so I always had a sense of myself where I was very cognizant of the role that history, the importance of history. So living that and reading it was something that made me interested in the topic. Writing it, I always wanted to write. I always wanted to be a writer. I grew up writing short stories. And so I thought of myself as a writer. So actually doing history, it was natural that the subjects would come together from that, from those two things. What about you?
Well,
journal. What made you think of journalism?
I wasn't interested in history as a child. I also grew up in Texas, actually.
It's a great place to be from.
Yeah.
And I mean that. In all senses of the word.
And my school was segregated,
Yeah.
even though it was after Brown v. Board of Education. I didn't like my social studies teacher. I didn't like that many teachers, just generally. I didn't find that many interesting teachers in the classroom. And it really wasn't until I went to Yale and I had a course with John Morton Blum, who was a great historian of 20th century American history, that I got really interested in. I not only loved his classes, I loved his reading list, because all the way through public schools, through public high schools in Fort Worth, you always had textbooks, and I always found the textbooks so boring. And yet, John Morton Blum assigned no textbooks. It's just a long reading list of historians, Richard Hofstadter and William Leuchtenberg and John Morton Blum and Oscar Handlin and so on, and Eric Goldman and so on and so forth. And they were not only great historians, but they were great writers. So I think that's when I first became interested in history, but not quite in writing history. You were way ahead of me on that. I really didn't get interested in writing until I was in law school.
Yeah, I was fortunate. My history teachers were always my best teachers from the time I was a kid. There are people, when you hear stories about people having the teacher who made a difference. In every one of my years, it would be the person. I had good English teachers too, but my history professors were uniformly wonderful. And it's interesting when looking at my kids who went to very, very good school here, but were less impressed with their history teachers. History was a problem. And I was very fortunate to have, at every stage, people who were really, really good. And so I had a natural inclination for the subject, but to have teachers who were actually good too, I think made a big difference. And then the writing, as I said, this was something that I always did anyway. It would make sense. It made sense. I thought about becoming a journalist after my sojourn in the desert. That you referred to so colorfully, Cahill, the desert, the government, the desert. Well, I suppose it was like that. And after I left Cahill, when I was thinking about leaving Cahill, I had it in my mind that I might become a journalist myself. Because the other thing that was in my mind, I knew that I wanted to make a living that in some way that involved writing. And I grew up, I was a teenager in the 70s, and of course I was a kid in the 70s, and Woodward and Bernstein were heroes, right? There was crusading journalists, and so I thought perhaps I could become a crusading journalist. And as I do anytime I, going to undertake things, I actually wrote to journalists and asked them, should I come into this profession? And I wrote to a journalist called Alexander Hamilton. No, not him, not someone else. Living in another era. Wow, that would have been interesting if he'd answered particularly. Alexander Coburn, whom I read in The Nation, and he asked me, how much money do you make? And I was at Cahill at this time, and I told him, and I distinctly remember him saying, oh. I was like, well, you're not going to get that being a journalist. And other people, Anthony Lewis, other people I didn't even know. I just sort of wrote them, and they were very, very kind in writing back to me, and very, very helpful as much as they could be. But I decided, I'd gotten an offer from the American Lawyer, but I eventually decided, that wasn't the way for me to go. But something that had to do with writing, something that had to do with with events that move the world in some way attracted me. So that. I had a brief foray, and my first job was at the Conroe Courier, our hometown newspaper. And so I used to actually sit there. I wrote what would have been the society column. It was my job. People sent in their wedding announcements. I was in high school. I was 16, and they would send in the wedding announcements. It was my job to turn it into something that could be in the Conroe Courier. So I had a brief flirtation with journalism as a teenager, and again when I was thinking about how to get out of the wilderness, but it didn't last.
Yeah. Well,
but you actually did it.
I did do it, and I actually got interested in journalism when I was at Yale Law School. This is not exactly an inspiring story of moving up on the merits, but I took a course with a professor named Fred Rodell. It was a course on writing about the law for laymen, not unlike the course that I teach at New York Law School, or I did. I did quite well in it, and I wanted to get a summer job, and so I wrote a letter to every newspaper in the country and every magazine in the country, and I got one response. It was from the New York Daily News, which said they might have a job for a copy boy. And I was just so deflated and discouraged. And I went to Fred, who insisted that you call him by his first name. I said, Fred, I just don't know what to do. He says, well, have you written in Newsweek? And I said, yes, I wrote Newsweek. I wrote the New York New York office of News. He said, no. Have you written the Washington Bureau of Newsweek? I said, no. He said, okay. Same letter, readdress it to Benjamin Bradley, Washington Bureau Chief, Newsweek magazine. This was in 1963. So I did, same letter. Fred puts on the margin, he says, Ben, take this guy. He's good. And I got the job. That was my first job in journalism. That was the summer of 1963. And those were very heady times in Washington, because Bradley was very close to John F. Kennedy, as you may know. I mean, they knew each other from Harvard, and they were really buddies. It was very, very well known. So I thought, well, I'm at the center of the universe, undoubtedly. And got to cover a lot of really neat stories. And Bradley was great. And my wife will remember that I tried to emulate everything about him. He was just so neat. I tried to get taller, and I couldn't get taller. And it didn't look good. He used to wear these big, thick, bright suspenders. And that didn't look good on me either. And he cursed a Blue Street. So I had to come home every night and try out my cursing on my wife. So that's how I entered journalism.
That's how you entered journalism.
That's right. I wanted to ask you, I know something of this story, but I think everybody would be interested in it. How you came to write that wonderful first book on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Well, I was at a party with Ed. Maybe it was a party that one of our, I was going to say Nadine, but one of our colleagues had given. It was Nadine's party. And we were talking about a movie that they were going to make about Jefferson, called Jefferson in Paris. And I remember seeing a number of articles and pieces in which people said, they're going to make this movie and they're going to treat this story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings as if it were true. And there's no evidence that that's the case. And Jefferson would never be involved with a slave girl. And I knew from my rather eccentric interest of having read lots of Jefferson biographies and read Fawn Brody's biography, in which she had in the back of the book the recollections of two men, a man named Madison Hemings and another man named Israel Jefferson. His real last name was Gillette. We've since found out, even after I wrote the book, we've recently found out his real last name was Gillette, but he was given the name Jefferson. But anyway, they talked about the fact that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had this long-term liaison, and Madison Hemings said he was indeed the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. So I knew that there was this notion that there was no evidence was not true. It may not have been proof, but to say that it was no evidence struck me as almost as if saying that the words of enslaved people didn't matter. You know, we don't have to listen to that because that's not real. And that offended me. It offended me that people said, you know, Jefferson wouldn't be involved with a slave girl. A slave girl, Sally Hemings was a person, and to sort of render her this cipher as this individual, this sort of shapeless, nameless being was offensive to me. So I decided that I was going to write an op-ed. And I was talking to Ed about this, and I decided that I was going to write an op-ed piece. And so I went to the New York Public Library, the Rose Room, if you know that beautiful room. And this was before it was renovated, and I thought it was beautiful. It's celestial now. And I sat there, and I started writing, and it got longer and longer and longer. And finally I said, you know, this is not right. This could be something bigger than just an op-ed piece. And I was not trained as a historian. I majored in history at Dartmouth, and I'd read a lot of history books, and I thought I knew how to write a book. But what I thought I could do was to make an intervention, because many of the people who wrote about this used law as, you know, when they wanted to, they'd say, well, if this were a court of law, blah, 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 and this is burden of proof. And they were using all these terms in ways that didn't make any sense. And if they really knew what they were talking about, they would understand that what they were saying was wrong. So I decided to make an intervention as a law professor to say, you know, if you want to play this game of evidence and what evidence is and what proof is and what witnesses are and how you view credibility, all those kinds of things, well, that's what we do. And so I conceived of the book as if I were talking to my students here about this particular case, and that's the structure of the book. And it's not the typical, I mean, historians would look at it and say that it's a law professor writing a book. It's not a typical history because I don't adopt the authoritative voice that historians typically have, but it's the style in law classes, asking questions, pointing things out, deconstruction. And so that's, and as I said, I was supposed to be working on a law review piece. I was working on some law review piece about prison reform. It just wasn't going anywhere. You all know how that, I mean, you know how that is, right? So it's just dead, you know, it's not going anywhere. But I was thinking I should be writing this, but I had this desire to do this other thing. And so in about 3 months, this is a long story, it's probably longer than you expected, but wanted me to go on, but I worked like 7 days a week. My husband would come home, he's at a firm at 8 o'clock. You know, I'd hand the kids off to them. They were little at the time, so you could put them to bed, and then I'd come back here at 10 o'clock from 10 until about 2 in the morning. And I did that for like 3 or 4 months. And it was just, I would wake up in mid-sentence. It was just that intense for me. There's probably another clinical word for this, which we won't talk about. But it was maniacal. It was just, it sort of consumed me because I just was at a white heat about how people, not so much did Tom and Sally have an affair, but the idea that people who were enslaved, when they got out of that and they told you what happened, for people to say, well, we don't have to listen to them, it was beyond infuriating to me. So that's why I decided to write the book. Have you ever had that kind of feeling about something? About a subject that not about something, but about a book that you're working on?
Nothing like that. I think the book that was most difficult for me, and I bordered on obsession, I kept thinking about it all the time, was the biography of Justice Douglas.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Someone stole my thunder there about, this question of looking at a figure like that and having one view and then changing the view of them. But go ahead.
And he was a difficult subject to deal with. He was very controversial. And I started out, I wanted to interview him. And he ignored all my requests. By then he he'd already had a stroke, but he was still on the court, and he wasn't going to leave easily. And he wouldn't see me, but in the meantime, I started interviewing everybody else. I was surrounding him. I interviewed his wife Kathy, and then I started interviewing his ex-wives, and then I started interviewing his colleagues and his former students, and finally I went out. I was looking for his two children. I interviewed his sister, and I went across country. He had a cabin in Goose Prairie, Washington, in the Cascades. And I was determined to find his son, who was described to me as the oldest living hippie. It was Bill Douglas Jr. Scott Poe will know all about it. He clerked for Justice Douglas. And I was looking for Bill Douglas Jr. And I heard he was somewhere out in the Northwest. Journalists can appreciate this. And I went to this dude ranch, right next to his cabin, and the two women who ran it knew him very well, and I knew they knew him very well, and I knew they knew where Bill Douglas Jr. was, and they were saying nothing. And I was staying there, and I was running out of money, and finally, the last day I was there, they said, "Well, you really ought to take a hike." So they gave me a special trail, literally, take a hike. And it was straight up the Cascade Mountain Trail. And I went all the way up. I spent the whole day, and it was gorgeous. It was absolutely gorgeous. And I came back down absolutely exhausted, but not too exhausted to say, "Can you give me a phone number?" And one of them wrote a phone number. And I called that number, and Bill Douglas Jr. answered the phone. And it was in Portland, Oregon. And I tried to be very casual about it, and I said, "Could I meet you?" And he said, "Yes." So I met him at a bar in Portland, Oregon. And
was he the oldest living hippie?
He was a wonderful, very eloquent, very sensitive and intelligent person. He may have also been, I didn't notice that. But we sat for 4 hours talking. And it's very much a part of my book. And then, so he said, "Have you met my sister?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, you ought to meet my sister." Well, I knew. His sister was a school teacher from England, so I didn't know where she was. She said, "Well, she's vacationing on the other side of the state in our old family cabin in eastern Oregon." I said, "Oh." I don't care, really. And I said, "Can I have a phone number?" She said, "There's no phone." So I just tootled. I got in the car, and I drove straight across the state, and I appeared. And she was great. Millie Douglas was great. She was very glad to talk to me. And she said, last part of it, she says, "Oh, would you be interested in any letters?" Family letters.
Oh, yeah.
Going back to my mother, who was Douglas's first wife. I said, "Yes." So that's the way that worked. And from then on, and then finally, last part of this, which is sort of an interesting story. I think it is. I wrote about it. And Scott will remember it. I'm doing work at the SEC, digging in, because Douglas, of course, was the chairman of the SEC. And I'm going there, and I call, as I always did when I came to Washington, I called Douglas's chambers, and I said, "Would Justice Douglas see me?" And the answer was always no. "Are you kidding?" "No." So I called, and that morning I said, "Well, Justice Douglas?" He said, "Yes." So I went over to the chambers, and Douglas was not in good shape. He had a stroke, and he was in a blanket. And I went in, and I started talking to him, trying to be charming and interesting and everything. And then after about 3 minutes, he fell asleep. And I was mortified. And I went out to see his secretary. I said, "He fell asleep." She said, "Oh, yes, that happens quite often. Just have a seat. He may wake up." And sure enough, in about 5 minutes, he used the buzzer. He buzzed, He said, "You may go in, Justice Douglas. We'll see you now." So I went in and completed the interview. It was great. But the point of why it was so difficult was I interviewed absolutely everybody that I could think of, and I felt like I knew Douglas better than, I'm sure I knew him better than he knew himself, because I got all kinds of views. I got friends, enemies, family, and former students, and so on. And there was a tremendous pressure to do it right, to get the portrait right, just like a portrait painter, to get the portrait right. And I was gratified because both Millie Douglas, the daughter, and Abe Fortas, the former student, who I also interviewed, told me that I got it right.
But you'd admired him before, and less so. How did you deal with that? Was there just sort of a slowly dawning realization that this person wasn't who you thought, or I mean, how did you deal with the sense of disappointment, and yet you still have to?
Well, I thought he stood for some wonderful things in our society. I mean, he was a great libertarian. He was a great environmentalist before that was popular. He was super smart. But he also had, he was not a good colleague on the court. I remember, and Steve Vermeil will I remember I interviewed Brennan for this biography, and he said that, the problem, he said, when we go into conference, if it's Hugo Black, he really lays it out. He's a real advocate for his point of view on a particular argument. And Douglas, by this time, now this is later in his career, he's not engaged. He's not engaged with the business of the court, and that was one rub. Also, he was not. I remember interviewing Vern Countryman, who clerked for Douglas, one of his early clerks, and he said, "Well, he said he was really rough. He was sort of a son of a bitch, but he was a son of a bitch for everybody, and it was okay because I really learned a lot, and he was so smart and so capable, particularly in the early years of his career." Now, in terms of the personal stuff, he was very rough on his family, and that had to be told, and I did.
So with these dual biographies, you have two people who are opposed, and as was mentioned today, one of those people is usually someone that you're more inclined to favor over the other.
Yeah.
How did you deal with that? I mean, did you think that you make an extra effort to look for things? Because I did a book about Andrew Johnson, of all people, a short book, and it was really tough to try to write about somebody that you don't like, or that is worse than that, or somebody who stands for everything that you despise, and at the same time to try to be fair to that person. What you meant when you mentioned before with Douglas, you said, well, he stood for some good things. Is that what you do in a Jefferson and a Marshall? I recall you had some skepticism about Jefferson that you were expressing to me very delicately because you thought I might be offended. But
I think we saw Jefferson pretty close to the same way. But,
so do you look for the good thing and then
I don't look for anything. I really don't. I only want to write about people who I admire, and I might admire them less after I finish the book. I don't think I really admired Douglas any less. I think I got to know him better. But I admired quite a lot about Douglas. With Jefferson and Marshall, I think you did pick up. I think I admired Jefferson a little bit less after doing the work on that. I thought he was quite devious in ways that I did not admire. Now with Roosevelt and Hughes, I can say I did not favor one over the other. I'd be surprised if anybody could pick up that I favored one over the other, because I admired both of them. Now,
Tawny?
Tawny, before Dred Scott?
Okay.
No, he was a superb lawyer, but it's easier to talk about, I think, Hughes and and FDR. I mean, FDR, he played fast and loose with the truth occasionally. We know that. I mean, he exaggerated quite a lot. John will know that. But he was such a master politician, and he was so, I think, courageous in what he stood for, much of what he stood for. Hughes was a very different kind of leader. I mean, Hughes was, I say the similarities and differences. The similarities were, they were both only children of doting parents, and both went to Ivy League schools. Both were reformed governors of New York. But Hughes, as was pointed out today, was the son of an itinerant immigrant preacher, and of course we know about Roosevelt. I mean, he lived in gilded splendor in Dutchess County, New York, and in the summers he would go to Europe with his family, and if they came to New York, they came in James Roosevelt's private railroad car. It was pretty neat. So they were very different, and in other words, they were very different too. I mean, that Hughes was a great, he had a great mind. He had a photographic memory too, which helps. And he was a superb student all the way through. I mean, he graduated from public school in New York at the age of 12. He said, at 12. And he says, I'm ready to go to college. And nobody would take him. He was only 12 years old. So he had to wait a year. Then he applied to Madison, which is now known as Colgate. And he made superb grades and got restless and decided to transfer to Brown, where he was a junior Phi Beta Kappa. And then he went to the Columbia Law School and graduated at the top of his class and made the highest grade ever made on the New York bar. And compare that with Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt was an indifferent student at Harvard. At Columbia Law School, he flunked a couple of courses. He didn't finish. Don't take this serious. He didn't finish, but he still passed the bar. But Roosevelt never liked practicing law. He didn't like being a student. Hughes liked being a student. He liked practicing law. He loved the law all the way through. So they were, to me, they were both brilliant and great leaders of the 20th century. Hughes was a great lawyer, a great investigator, in my view, a progressive chief out of the progressive wing of the Republican Party. I could only wish he were Chief Justice today. And Roosevelt was probably the most gifted politician, certainly of the 20th century, and maybe ever, and critically so for modern America. I would say the same with Hughes. Hughes really did usher in the modern constitutional era. I mean, he didn't do it alone, but he did it. So I would come away saying they were both great leaders, and I liked them. I admired both of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned Roosevelt as the consummate politician, and in a way that was sort of, you said, but in a way that the politician side of him is not the most admirable side, because that's the one that requires a lot of maneuvering, perhaps. And I say that because you could say the same thing about Jefferson.
Yeah. That
both of them are politicians. John Meacham is doing a book about Jefferson called Jefferson and the Art of Power. And it's pretty clear, that the idea is to remind people that when you talk about hypocrisy and deceitfulness and those kinds of things. His job was to be a politician. And politicians, the things that politicians have to do, if they want to be effective, that don't comport with, I mean, they can't be ideologues, really. They can't hold fast to positions, or else they will not be effective. And so they're similar. I mean, I get the idea that FDR could be mean-spirited at points. I would not say that about Jefferson.
Well, I would say that I felt that Jefferson, and you're more an expert than I am, but that Jefferson was a fairly devious fellow at times in the way he pushed his agenda forward, but he didn't want to be involved. And I don't think I think Roosevelt was a master politician, and he worked behind the scenes, but I think he owned up to what he was really trying to do.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe a little more than Jefferson. I admired both. I obviously admire both of them, as I did Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln, I love Lincoln.
Well, it's interesting because people always ask you when you're writing about. I think a lot of historians aren't even sure that biographers are really historians, because the identification that you have with an individual can be problematic. I mean, historians are supposed to be objective. Nobody can be totally objective, but there's supposed to be a certain level of detachment. And just wondering, in writing about people, when you're writing about an individual, how do you maintain distance, enough distance to really see what they're doing? And when you describe your writing about Douglas, you just had to say, all right, these are some things that are admirable about him. Here's some things he doesn't do very well, and I just have to write it. And that's just the determination, not to sugarcoat.
Yeah, and maybe it's helpful to do a dual biography, because there's a tension there, and you don't necessarily concentrate on one or the other. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about your book on the Hemmings of Monticello, which is just a marvelous book. Did you? I mean, I have several questions, but how did you go about approaching the research for that? I mean, I would have been just exhausted thinking about everything that you had to do. How did you structure it? Do you know how exactly you were going to go about researching this very, very large project?
Well, unlike the first book, since this was a narrative, the structure suggested itself. You start with, I was going to write about the family, the generations of the family, so you start with the matriarch of the family, Elizabeth Hemmings. And so it was somewhat problematic because we don't know that much about her. There are a few snippets of things in wills. She's an item of property, so she appears in, wills, that kind of thing. And so you're not really getting her words, or people aren't talking about her. I mean, at one point she's in a will, and John Wales, who at some point is the father of her kids, mentions, that where she's supposed to go, what's supposed to happen to her. So, but just starting out with a person, and you have that person's birth date, then you just work your way forward. I knew when I was writing about her, I had to write about the title of the first chapter is Young Elizabeth's World. So the chronology or the story of Virginia in the 1730s becomes the structure, and then I just sort of moved forward with the people as they moved forward, and that was an easy thing to do. The structure suggested itself, the chronology suggested itself. It was just a question of doing it, and I knew where the material would be, either at Monticello and Jefferson's records, Jefferson's memorandum books, farm books, or the Virginia Historical Society, where all the papers. I mean, the Library of Virginia has all of the official documents of Virginia. The Virginia Historical Society has family letters, all the plantation records and so forth. So the chronology sets the structure, and then it's just a matter of going through all of that stuff.
So as you go through it, and as you make your way to the end of the manuscript, were there any surprises, any things that major surprises in terms of what you discovered or what you concluded?
There were a few things. I think John Wales, who was the father of Jefferson's wife, Martha, and also the father of Sally Hemings, was described in history books as a man who was trained as a lawyer in England. And it turns out that he was actually a servant who was brought over. He was brought over as a servant from England, which is very different. A person who's trained as a lawyer in England would have been someone who was at least a middle-class background, in England. There were some, farmers' sons who maybe gone up to the bar, but for the most part, you would think of somebody who was relatively well off. But a person who's brought over as a servant is a very different class. So that means a different story about Jefferson's wife. And it means also that John Wales, obviously he was different than his children who were enslaved in terms of race, in terms of, he wasn't a chattel, but he was a servant. So that means he was not that far from Sally Hemings. He did the same kinds of things that his sons would have been doing. So that was sort of a surprise, because that, I think, as I said, changes not only the Hemings' story, but it changes Jefferson's story and his wife. For people to know in a very class-bound society that his wife's father had been a servant. And they actually, in their Virginia Gazette stories where people make fun of him. So that's, they were wealthy. He was very, very wealthy, but, wealth in a society like that's very much family-bound, and, how much money you have doesn't make any difference. It's who your family is and the prominence of your family. So that was a surprise. The other surprise is that this was something I had seen in the first book. When I was working on the first book, I was at Poplar Forest, which was Jefferson's home away from home. When in retirement, when everybody started coming to Monticello, he just kind of said, okay, I'll leave it to you and I'll go to Poplar Forest to get away from everyone. I found some letters in which he is writing to his overseer, and he says, Johnny Hemings will be coming with me, and Johnny Hemings and his assistants will be coming with me, and the rest of the family will come later. They're like 4 or 5 letters like that. He never says who Johnny Hemings' assistants are, but John Hemings, his assistants were Beverly, Madison, and Eston Hemings, Sally Hemings' sons. His sons were Sally Hemings. So they're going to Poplar Forest, and he would be there for weeks at a time. And he would also go there with his grandchildren, his grandchildren with his legal wife. And so I'd never thought about the fact, and if you look up at the granddaughter's letters and Jefferson's letters, they're going at the same time. So I'd never thought about the fact that there's Jefferson with John Hemings and his sons, and his legal white grandchildren, daughters, are traveling together to go off to this place where they're going to stay for weeks at a time, in the summer. They spend the summer. So what that meant was I hadn't realized that they'd spent a lot of time together, Jefferson and the Hemings children. The thinking would be that, Madison Hemings can't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know, because he wouldn't have been around Jefferson. But they spent lots of time together. So that was something that I hadn't put in the first book, because the first book had a different focus. But when I was actually telling these people's stories, and I'm writing about the Hemings children and their lives at Monticello, that made me think differently about Jefferson's connection to them, because it's clear that they spent a lot of time together. And not only did they spend a lot of time together, but Jefferson's grandchildren, his granddaughters, were there too. Madison Hemings names one of his daughters, Ellen Wales Hemings, and one of Jefferson's granddaughters who would be traveling with them was Ellen Wales. So you sort of wonder why she's the one, of course, who repudiates them in the letter when she says, it wasn't my grandfather, it was these cars, but he names his daughter after her. So, which is an indicator of a level of closeness that surprised me. I had not thought about them, hanging. I knew he's a woodworker and they were carpenters, and that's why, he actually made furniture with John Hemings. But I hadn't thought about the fact that he's doing that with his sons as well.
Maybe we ought to open it up to some questions if anyone has questions. Here's one thing.
There's Steve's back there.
Hello again, Jim. Annette, it's nice to see you back.
Yes, good to be back.
I have the impression that every biography is in some important measure an autobiography. And I wondered if you would say anything about whether you believe that and about what parts of yourselves you feel are in your own books.
It's a good question.
It is a good question.
You want to go first while I think about it? It might be too revealing, but
I don't think any of my books are autobiographical, but though Ed pointed out that I certainly have certain values, so I seek out subjects who I may share my values, or I might share their values. So the idea of those who would be strongly in favor of civil rights and liberties would be very important to me. Those who believe in a great intellectual development, and, I would say, I so admired Jefferson for his mind. I admired Lincoln for his mind. I admired Roosevelt in a very different way, but he had a very capacious mind. I mean, people don't think, well, he's not, he was a lousy student, and he wasn't. He didn't have the intellectual rigor, I think, of some others, but he had so many interests, and he had a capacity to pull in information from so many areas that it was quite impressive. So that's something that I began to value with my liberal education, and I still do. And as I said, civil rights and liberties are very important to me. And as Ed said, probably there is certainly a liberal tilt to my heroes, to my category, the people I put in my category of heroes. So in that sense, it would be autobiographical. But I still have my first wife, unlike Douglas, who went through 4. And so a lot of it's just concentrating on my subjects.
well, I would say my first book is very definitely about engaging with race and American history, and that following through with that problem, working out that problem, is certainly how it sort of mirrors what I've been working out in my own life. So my obsessions, my thoughts about these things definitely shape that book. I mean, I think even more so than the Hemmings is the Monticello, which is a more conventional thing. The first book really is me. I mean, it's a product of everything that I, ever learned, from my parents, from school, it's all much the sort of tutored Annette, it's just unvarnished. That I think that book is more me than the Hemmings. The Hemmings and Monticello is more of my obsessiveness. But I mean, it works that way. But the pure me, I think, is in the first book, and is very definitely a product of all the things that happened to me, and the sort of obsession, as I said, the engagement that I have with race, American history, the way I think about things. I mean, I grew up, just I'd get a topic that I liked, and or about writing and writers, and I would go and try to find out every single thing I could about, say, Hemingway or say Sinclair Lewis, and then find out that Sinclair Lewis had a great rivalry with Theodore Dreiser. And so then I would read about Sinclair Lewis, not just in what his biographer said, but what Dreiser's biographer said. And it would be very different. And so this thing of looking at, I could probably write a book about literary feuds from all the stuff that I did. So when I'm writing this book, when I came to write this book, that process of saying, one person says this, the slap heard around the world. Sinclair Lewis slapped Theodore Dreiser, and it was a big scandal. And so one view of it from Dreiser people, one view from Sinclair Lewis people, one view from people who are neutral observers. And you look at this kind of stuff and try to figure out, I didn't write anything about this, but this was the kind of stuff that I used to do growing up. And so when I came to write this book, the first book, I'd been doing that thing since I was 13. It was not like work. This is what I did as a hobby. And so, yeah, it was very definitely me. The Hemingses of Monticello is something different. It's much more formal. But that's to the extent that I'm continuing this engagement with American history and race and slavery, it's very definitely. It's still a part of me, but not so much as the first one. Another question? Oh, this one.
Jim, I guess this is for you, but Annette, if you have done contemporary, more journalistic books, I don't think you have, but if you have, it's for you as well. Which do you prefer, dealing with people who are alive or dead?
I enjoyed the Douglas book very much. It was a very tough book to do. It was a tougher book to do in many ways than the Roosevelt Hughes book because I didn't have anybody to interview, and I had so many people to interview for Douglas. But there's a challenge to the Roosevelt Hughes book, as with the Jefferson Marshall and the Lincoln Tawney, because so much has been written about all of them. I mean, and so much has been written even about, I'm looking at people who've written really good books on what I was writing about. And so to make it fresh and original. So that's a tough thing to do, to try to pull out what I think is the essence of the two and of their conflict and ultimately their friendship. So that was tough also. But I think doing the legwork and of a Douglas kind of book is probably a tougher book to write. None of them were easy. At least I didn't think they were easy.
Yeah. Well, the closest thing I've come to that is a book that I did with Vernon Jordan, which is a very different thing. I was working with his memoirs, and so in a sense I wasn't free to say whatever I wanted to say, but it was as if I'm going to be doing a biography of Jefferson after a couple of other books that I'm supposed to do, but it's like working with somebody who's alive and who you're talking to and you feel that you have a connection to. It's very difficult to be detached. I suppose if I were writing a biography of him and I had the freedom to sort of say what I wanted to say, it would be more like what you're talking about, the difficulty. The difficulty here, writing about somebody who's alive, is that you care about him, right? Your interests become merged with that person. And so I can't pretend that I have any objectivity about him at all. I might suggest that I have objectivity about Jefferson, but maybe not. I think I do, but other people might say I don't. But certainly if the person is alive, and if you like the person, it's very, I think even if I were doing a biography of him, I couldn't do a biography of him. People have asked me, they said, would you do a biography of him? I said, no, because I know what I would have to do. I would have to have that kind of detachment, but he's a friend, and so it's not the kind of thing that I would want to ever do. So I think it would be harder. If I had met the person beforehand, to be doing something that, or when people do authorized biographies of people, I think I wonder about that because, it's nice to be able to have all the letters and so forth, but it would be difficult for me to maintain the kind of detachment that I think works best if you really want to tell somebody's life story. Like you said with Douglas, at some point you just got to say,
Well,
he was a jerk
I
sometimes.
think if you're trained as a journalist, you do tend take a detached view, or you try to. One of my concerns about there was a 2-volume work on Hughes, which is by Merleau Pusey, and he had access. It was an authorized biography. He had access to Hughes, which was great, but he just idolized Hughes. I mean, it was just everything Hughes did was great. There was nothing that was not great. It was either great or greater. and at a certain point, it just got tiresome, and I just sort of pushed back on that, which I think you have to do. I mean, talking about authorized biographies, I just wouldn't do that.
Professor Gordon-Reed, I wonder if you could talk about when you first started writing the first book and how your feelings may have evolved about Jefferson's relationship with Sally Heming. Because it sounds that when you went into the second book, you were not only writing a book about race, but also a story about an American family. And what your feelings were when you started about Jefferson and how they may have evolved as you learned about this other family that he had.
Well, I would say I don't think they evolved. I mean, writing the first book, I don't think they evolved very much at all, because having grown up in Texas and grown up in the South, I understood that this kind of connection, this kind of relation, however you want to describe it, was commonplace. And so it wasn't as though it was something that was like a revelation and then you go, oh, this is a part of slavery. It was as much a part of slavery as buying and selling people. Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates is done, when he does those TV shows about DNA and so forth, like the company that he deals with says, they talk about, they've gone through the South and they've done DNA testing on African American males, and they find that upwards of 45% of African American males have European Y male chromosomes. And it's not like Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan and his brothers apparently cut a swath in Asia, so the Y chromosome is all the same. These are different people. These are different families. And that's just the guys. It doesn't account for women because we don't have a Y chromosome. You can't do that. So this is something that was endemic to the society. So the idea that this would have been some major thing, didn't change my attitude about Jefferson in that sense. When I started writing about the family, and this point that I mentioned about Poplar Forest, when I figured out I kind of knew this from, when I knew this in the first book, who the children were named for, the people who were connected to Jefferson and why they were connected to Jefferson. I found out even more when I started writing the Hemings of Monticello. I think I had a greater sense of the conflict that must have been in him. There was a letter that his secretary, a guy named William Short, he was the secretary to Jefferson when he was in Paris, who stayed on as an envoy to Spain after Jefferson. He lived in Europe for many years after Jefferson came back in 1789. And he writes to Jefferson in 1798, and he says, I've been in Spain for all this time, and I've been thinking about this situation with race and slavery in America. And I think what should happen, the way we solve this problem, is that black people and white people should intermarry. He said, I'm living in Spain, and people in Spain, I know people in, he basically was saying Spanish people look like mulatto people, essentially. He said, I know people in Virginia, there are women in Virginia who, and he mentioned this one woman, who looks, looks like a Spanish, and everybody thinks that this is fine. Spanish people look perfectly attractive people, and we could all look like that. And so he essentially writes this to Jefferson in 1798. He says, what do you think? So Jefferson gets this, he writes this, and Jefferson kept a listing of all the letters he sent out, the date they came in and the date he sent out. So we know when he gets the letter. So he gets the letter in June of 1798. Beverly Hemings, his eldest son but Sally Hemings, was born in April of 1798. So he gets this letter, and so you're thinking, gosh, what is he going to say, right? his hair must have been standing on. So he writes to them and says, you know, this is the answer. We should have children with people. And pretty soon, they will be bred out, because there are more of us than there are of them, and we'll end up looking Spanish, is essentially what he says. So he writes this to him. And Jefferson, he says, so what do you think? Nothing. No response. So then it takes a long time for letters to get back and forth on the Atlantic. So the next year he writes to him again, and he gets the letter. He says, you remember that letter that I wrote to you, and when I said, what do you think? Nothing. He tries one more time. And then he says, perhaps I've taxed you too much with this subject matter. Now, Short was living at the Hotel Longueuil with Jefferson and Sally Hemings and James Hemings. So we don't know what he knew about this. But and Gordon Wood, who's really a great historian, he did a review of my book, and what I so admired about him is that he starts the review with that story, because it is, to my mind, the single most amazing thing. It's the first letter. It's the only instance I know where any of Jefferson's friends challenged him on notes on the state of Virginia. Because in this letter, he says, you know, there are some learned people, meaning you, Mr. Jefferson, who believe that intermixture of the races is a bad thing. And then he launches into this thing about Spain. And so he basically paraphrases what Jefferson says in the notes and challenges him on it. And he asked him 3 times to respond, and Jefferson never responded to it. And so from things like that, that's telling, you know, because this is his friend. He calls this guy his adoptive son. And his son is challenging him and asking him for an answer, and he won't give it. So I think I have a better sense from seeing the family, because it's not just about Sally Hemings. She doesn't make any sense by herself. It's his brothers. They are his valets, his personal servants. They travel around with him. It's a web of relationships that she is a part of with him and his wife. This is his wife's half-sister. And putting all this together, I have, sympathy is not the word, but I have more of an understanding of, I think about what the turmoil must have been there, you know, and when he comes in from retirement in 1809, and his legal daughter and all of her children moved to Monticello, and so he's got all his grandchildren there, and his, you know, enslaved children. These people are all together. There's no way. And it would change the way he dealt with them, because of his grandchildren being there. So you're forced to think, once you think chronologically about things, and you're not thinking about, the first book is really analytical. Now I had to think about how people were actually living, if I'm telling their story. And so it changed my sense of as I said, with the turmoil, the difficulty of that situation, because he didn't, you know, he could have had them over at Poplar Forest, some other place, but they were all there together. And that's an amazing thing to think about. I think that's one of the reasons historians don't like the story. It's not that I don't think that people didn't believe that this was possibly true. It's that if you accept it, it means you have to deal with it. And it's much easier to say, oh, that didn't happen. Now the thing is, oh, it happened, but his daughters didn't know anything about it. And if nobody knew anything about it but him and Sally, then we don't have to deal with it. And I think I cannot believe that people didn't really think, who actually thought that this was impossible, is that, no, if we accept this means we have to write about her. When we see Ellen's letters and she's talking about the wonderful trips to Poplar Forest and how they used to have picnics, when I know that Madison and Beverly and Eston are there too, even though they're not speaking, they're not in the letters, the historian has to imagine what that time was like, and that's very, very disconcerting, I think, to a lot of people. You'd just rather not deal with it.
Okay, I think we're going to have to end it there, but it's a great place to end it. And I just want to thank Jim and Annette for joining us tonight. Jim's contribution to our understanding of the Supreme Court through his work is only matched by his contribution to this community here at New York Law School. And I think that this event really highlights that, bringing together our current faculty, our beloved former faculty, students, and those of our extended community that we've brought here today to talk about these interesting issues. So I have just a little something for each of you as just a small token of our appreciation for allowing us to be part of this event and for participating in it with us. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
And we've said a lot of thank yous today, and there are so many to go around still, but I'll just briefly say thank you again to Nadine Strassen and Ed Purcell, who were instrumental in bringing this great group of distinguished speakers together. It really made for such a wonderful day. So thank you both very much. And then finally, it's worth saying another thank you to Sarah Ferguson and Sarah Garrett. As Jim mentioned, so the Law Review holds 4 symposia per year. We're involved in 4 each year. And those ideas come to us from different sources and in different ways. And as Jim mentioned, in this particular case, it all started because Rick Matazar stopped me in the hallway one day and said, Jim has a new book coming out, let's do something. And that was literally the assignment that we had. It was just the germ of this idea. And that's the assignment that Sarah had, and they really ran with it, working over the past year persistently and diligently with a lot of creativity, developing the program and the themes, and working with all of our great speakers. So I want to thank them, and we have a little something for them as well. So as I disappear behind the podium. So yes, exactly. So so thank you both, and thank you all for being here. Have a great rest of the evening, and we appreciate it.
I'd like to get a picture of my